All right, how y'all doing? This C Talk once again. You know it's Griot C Talk, and I am so honored um, to have this guest, and I'm really ready to jump in this conversation. Before we jump into this conversation, please make sure you like, you share, um, you follow, you subscribe. Shout out to One Institution for giving me this platform and this opportunity to interview people because you know what we do on C Talk. We have conversations that plant seeds, and so we want you to grow and we want to build together in all seriousness. So go ahead and if you want to donate, you know what I'm saying, to what I'm doing and whatnot, I'm a published author myself, and just donate to our time. You can go ahead and cash at me at dollar sign Logic I'm in, or at Logic I'm in on Venmo. Dr. West, if she wants any kind of donations, we can put it in the comments, or she can just go ahead and voice that now. Um,
I'm
she's
just here
gonna
to
go.
support your work.
It is the season. It is eggnog season, so I have some lactose-free eggnog. Um, I don't know if that's the visual for our topic today. I don't know if that's the appropriate visual for our topic today. You'll understand what I'm talking about. But the topic today is very, 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 very taboo, and I am so honored to be enlightened by Dr. West. She is going to be talking about the impact that pornography has on the Black community, specifically a focus on our relationships. And I found out about this sister on Dr. Joy Bradford's platform, which she does some therapy for quote unquote Black girls.
Mhm.
And I'm a big, big, big supporter of Joy Bradford. She's just dope. I think
Mhm.
she does incredible work. Um, I love her accent. She got that. Oh man, and so I'm scrolling through there and I see this tagline. I mean, it got me. I'm a Pisces already, so it's easy to bait this fish. And I see the pornography, and in all seriousness, you might, hear me throwing some puns around, but this is a serious topic. But I really do nerd out on pretty much anything. And people might think it's a little weird, but I nerd out on the sex worker slash porn industry, because those people have stories and they have lives. And I want to know what goes through their mind and what goes through their hearts and what goes through their souls, and and what do they experience outside of the cameras and their clientele and whatnot. I've watched a couple documentaries, I read up on it, and I'm just really fascinated about sexuality, especially when it comes to Black males and females and the Black community, because we have so many Puritan values that really cloud our vision and disrupt and interrupt our learning and education of how we relate to each other when it comes to sexuality. And just something as simple as the concept of sexuality lies on a spectrum is just mind blowing to so many Black people specifically. And so I saw this tagline, pornography, the impacts and whatnot, and just heard her speak. And and I'll let her introduce it, but she kept talking about this documentary she did. I'm like, and I looked it up and I was like, it was like 3 minutes. I was like, no, I want more. And no, I didn't want more for the images. I wanted more for the
The
for the
content.
education, but the images are there, by the way. So
Mhm.
if you do see it, that is a disclaimer. It is yeah, it's uncut. But what's even more uncut and what's more raw is her breakdown of how it impacts us. So, anyways, without any further ado, um, uh, Dr. Carolyn West, and she is a professor at the University of Washington, Tacoma. And I'll allow her to, you know, give us a little bit of a profile and how she got into this work, this very important work she does around pornography and sexuality.
I'm a clinical psychologist by training, so that's my that's my background. And so I'm a domestic violence researcher, really. I started doing work around sexual violence and sexual assault, domestic violence, particularly within communities of color in the African American community. And so I've always been interested in media images. And my colleagues were all doing research on pornography. And I asked, well, is anybody looking at race and racism in pornography? And nobody was. So I started to have a lot of questions that I felt like needed to be answered. And I was really deeply concerned about the images that I was seeing and was concerned about, well, how does this promote violence and how does this shape the way we see ourselves and our sexuality? So just started doing the research from there.
Yeah, where you originally from? I want what's the genesis story behind, Dr. West? Any relation to Kanye?
No, or
Okay, okay.
Cornell. So not that I'm
Or
aware of.
Cornell. Too.
Yeah.
Man, I really appreciate me some Cornell West, man, with his $5 words. You got to have a thesaurus and a dictionary when that brother gets started. But where
Yeah.
you originally from,
I'm
sister?
originally from St. Louis.
Okay,
I
you're a
did my
Midwest person like me. Okay,
Midwest, yeah. So I did my bachelor's, master's, and PhD at the University of Missouri. Spent some time at the University of Notre Dame doing my pre-doctoral internship, and then
that's
was
South
at
Beach. I mean South
South
Bend, right?
Bend and
Yep.
was at Illinois State for a year doing my first
Okay.
postdoc. And my second postdoc was at the University of New Hampshire in family violence research. And then I moved here to take the job at the University of Washington, Tacoma. So,
So let's just get right into it. Um, let's just go ahead and dig deep
mm,
and get into it. There's a whole bunch of puns. Let's just get into it.
mm.
Um, Talk about, in all seriousness, how does it exploit specifically Black women? I watched the documentary. I might have to watch it a couple more times. I mean, it was really fascinating. You had me seeing things a different way. How does it exploit and impact Black women and how they see themselves, how we treat them?
Okay, so I looked at mainstream pornography. So this is information that's readily available. And I was particularly interested in the images that were on the front and back covers and the descriptions. And what I found with Black women is that there was violence against women in general, but Black women in particular, we were more likely to be depicted as prostitutes, sex workers, more than other racial groups. Mainstream pornography also sort of attacked Black women's body types, so weight and skin tone and hair texture. And so it was really common to see, titles like nappy headed hoe. I mean, just really very graphic titles around that, very disparaging of Black women's body types, particularly brown skinned Black women. So really was concerned about that and the types of terminology. We were oftentimes they depicted Black female performers like in low income communities, urban, uh, inner city type, a very narrow definition of who and what Black women were.
Mm. So, what would you say to someone that says, "Well, that's what you expect when you go into, porn. There's got to be some kind of artistic license when it comes to porn. It's not real. They should have an artistic license and freedom, and that's number one. They should be able to create art how they want to create it. And then number two, what if someone said something to the nature of, well, all women then get, it's kind of like the same argument of all lives matter. Someone could say porn, oppresses and exploits and has that same treatment towards all women. Why is it necessarily specific to Black women, and shouldn't porn be able to do it since it is a theatrical performance?
I would argue, though, that the images didn't come out of nowhere. They're deeply rooted in history. And of all the images that they could produce, why these particular images? And they're so consistent with what we see throughout history and culture. And it's also problematic that there are no other images. There are fewer images of Black women. And so you have this very narrow definition within porn and within popular culture. And there's no balanced representation. And that's
Mm.
hugely problematic too.
Okay, talk about a little bit when you talk about it didn't come out of nowhere. You know what I'm saying? It just didn't come out of the ether. And I'm gonna throw you up a couple lobs. Talk a little bit about this genre of porn that shows and depicts white supremacists, you know what I'm saying, having sexual relationships with black women.
Yeah, the title of the documentary is "Let Me Tell Y'all About Black Chicks," and it's that I took the title from a 1980s porn film that came out right around the time the VCR became popular and people could watch it within their own homes. And it was taken off off VCA, it was taken off the video market because there was a scene from that video that depicted black women having sex with white performers dressed as Ku Klux Klan members. And so, what porn oftentimes does is it takes these sexualized images and sexualizes trauma, historical trauma for black women, and that's hugely problematic because
Mhm.
there was a lot of sexual assault throughout our history, and the Ku Klux Klan and other vigilante groups were involved in that. So if you don't understand that history and you are looking at that, consuming that, I think that really shapes how you see black women and our history, and that's really problematic.
Yeah, I've seen some literature and around like different fantasies that are supposed to be, you know,
Mm.
healthy, you know, sexual fantasies. And one genre of sexual fantasies is rape fantasy. And, you know, people act out those kind of, you know, experiences and it
Mhm.
turns them on, you know. It's kind of like what do they call it? Like BDSM, you know,
Mhm.
like, you know, things that include also, you know, whips and chains and handcuffs and, you know, submitting to, you know, one another and whatnot,
Mhm.
bondage.
Well,
A
I
lot
think
of
the
people are in
difference, though, my concern is several things. That black girls tend to be adultified and sexualized in
that. Mhm.
ways that other groups aren't. So there was a
Yeah.
study done by Georgetown Law Center called Black Girlhood Interrupted. And they found that adults saw Black girls as more older, more knowledgeable about sex, needing less comforting, needing less support. And
Mhm.
so I'm not saying pornography causes that, but it's a part of a culture that really depicts Black girls that way. So when they're victimized, nobody really seems to care or to
Yeah.
intervene. And we saw that, I really believe, with the R. Kelly situation, how he was able to do that kind of victimization for decades and not really be held accountable and make pornography with young girls. So I think it spills over into the lives of young girls and women in a way that can be profoundly damaging, as well as many men who purchase sex are also porn consumers. And if they're
Mhm.
consuming these images of with black women and girls sort of being less valuable, how are then they treating young women?
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think that what do you think about the comment or the commentary or the feedback that would say, well, that kind of relationship of how we disrespect women, especially black women, is going to be there whether we have porn or not? What do you think about that statement?
Well, porn certainly amplifies that, normalizes that. It
Mhm.
certainly doesn't help matters.
Mhm. When you talk about, yeah, that's a good point. When you talk about adultifying little black girls, I think about some of the genres that exist, um, and just from looking at your documentary, you know, those kind of like depictions that show um, black women or quote unquote black girls um, having sexual relationships with their stepfathers, you know, which could be trigger all kinds of trauma when it comes around abuse in the family. When you have a new member of the family that abuses, you know, what I'm saying the young woman, you know, what I'm saying, in the family, and and just seeing how it also correlates to um, just real life, you know, what I'm saying, sexual abuse cases in the black community and you got porn, you like totally, like you said, amplifying this fantasy relationship between a step parent, you know what I'm saying, and a child, sometime a minor, um, you know. So it really amplifies that. I think there's a correlation too into this, not only the sexual abuse, but you were talking about the um the incidence of STIs and STDs, you know what I'm saying, in the black community.
So we know that here's a group that's particularly vulnerable. And again, it's too simplistic to say pornography causes that, but the lack of medical care, health care, but these images out there that says this is who and what we are, they influence how black women are treated when they go for medical care, how they're treated when they report sexual violence in their lives, not being believed, not seen as credible. And so these images that permeate our entire society, I think just pornography is the extreme example of that. But we're talking about hundreds of years of history being, and it's also being amplified through pornography and other
Mhm.
forms of sexualized media, just makes it far more complicated.
How do you think it would impact the numbers if there was more education or even more censorship or less access to pornography? What do you think it would do to those numbers of STIs and sexual abuse in the black community?
Again, I think it's so complex because there are other factors here:
Yeah.
lack of education, lack of resources, lack of access to medical care. We're not necessarily having critical conversations. We need to be having critical conversations about all of these things.
Yeah.
And we need systemic change so that people get access to the care that they need.
Absolutely. I see there's a definite correlation between like the medical apartheid, sister
Mhm,
wrote a whole book on that,
mhm,
and the porn industry, you know what I'm saying? And just how black women are viewed in a kind of like a continuum that
mhm,
the porn industry creates. It's a continuum of these stereotypes, the adultifying, that they have less value than other women. And that I think that becomes, it transitions very easily, almost seamlessly into the medical apartheid that, what I'm saying, impacts our community. Like, oh,
mhm,
you're not feeling anything, you can take it, things of that nature, especially when like, gang sex is being amplified, and
mhm,
pornography, multiple partners, unprotected sex. And we see these black women with these, you know, uh, at times extraordinary bodies, physically fit, able to do all these things on camera when you can edit and, what I'm saying, you
mhm.
can, make it a theatrical performance. They're doing all these things and it kind of, well, kind of, if not, creates this superwoman, you know what I'm saying? And that transitions and bleeds into real life.
Right. So it's really, if you're getting your sex education from pornography, that's not going to be very helpful, or it's not going to promote a healthy sexuality, because that's not what real sex is, what we see in pornography. And
Hmm.
then if you don't have anything to balance that off with medically accurate sex education, or really
Hmm.
safe places where young people can talk about their sexuality, then where do they get that information from?
Right. Yeah, they're doing, I mean, I don't really want to go into details,
Mhm,
but they're doing all kinds of stuff in porn that, like they always used to say, even when I was young, do not try this at home.
mhm,
You know what I'm saying? And we got people that don't even know about bodies, their bodies, s let alone someone else's body. They don't know enough about bacteria. They don't know enough
mhm,
about science and viruses to be trying to pull off this stuff. And they don't know that a lot of these actors, are like performing and they're actually, taking these STI, STD tests, every time they perform. There's a whole, protocol, that safety protocol that they go through to make sure that this, that experience and that performance, what I'm saying, as professionals, even amateurs, to a certain degree, is as safe as possible. When we talk about the word safe, tell us what pornography does to disrupt safe places for Black women and Black young women.
I think it can spill over. We're seeing kids watching porn at school on their devices. We're seeing young people pressuring other young people to act out scenes from pornography. So seeing it really spill over, it doesn't stay sort of in the fantasy realm. And that ends up being really problematic in like violent dating relationships.
Yeah, yeah.
It's too, again, it's too simplistic to say that pornography causes these problems, but we have done some correlational studies that found that young Black women, for example, who were exposed to pornography, reported more sexually transmitted infections like chlamydia or desire to become pregnant earlier, or were less likely to use contraception, or were likely to be exposed to dating violence. So again, it's too simplistic to say porn causes these problems because you have an intersection of other problems there,
Mhm.
but it certainly doesn't seem to make it better.
Yeah. What I like to remind people is, and I'm glad that you said that, like, there's no such thing as causation. I mean, there is, but it's almost impossible, on a social science and a science on a social science level to prove it. If you know
Right.
anything, if you take in any, what I'm saying, like, entry level um, course in
Statistics,
social
yeah.
studies. Exactly. It's really, really difficult to prove causation. But you can, get some traction from correlation. And from that, start saying, well, what if we did this? Would it limit or will it excel? This or that and a third. And when you said schools become unsafe places for young women, that hit me. That hit me hard. And I never really thought of it like that. I thought of it before, but never really like that. As a school principal, just rearranging and reorganizing my thoughts to focus on young people and not just young men. Young girls too are watching a lot of porn, and we getting a lot of same-sex relationships between young women too. But watching some porn while they're in school, logging off of that porn site, walking around in the hallways, and trying to find an opportunity to act out what they just now saw because they're so stimulated, I'm saying, by what they just now saw. And I think about so many incidents that happen in, undisclosed places in our school, what I would call like, blind spots in our schools and the elevators and when there's not a lot of, monitoring and supervision because we can't be everywhere, all the time. I wonder if that person who was the aggressor or even the receiver, you know, is, a fan or supporter, saying, or a watcher of porn. And if it's like, because, a lot of the themes and the plots are corny as all get out, along with the music most of the time. But,
You don't
you
know that
know,
people focus that much on when they're watching,
see, I
you
told you
know.
I'd be nerding out. I'm also a producer and I also create films. But in all seriousness, these situations and scenarios that they create, you know what I mean? Like, you're making out and getting it on with your stepsister, what I'm saying, underneath the table while mom and dad are having dinner, or they're in the other room arguing about dad's gambling addiction. You know what I'm saying? And you're doing all, like it creates these scenarios. I came over to borrow some milk and, got something else more than I really wanted. It creates these scenarios that are unreal. And I think it normalizes a lot of things that aren't necessarily healthy for uneducated, what I'm saying, people.
It certainly can. So we need to be having, critical conversations. And we also have to think about how Black men are depicted in pornography as well, because that can be equally as damaging. And some of that is again deeply rooted in history.
Hmm.
Uh, Even, after slavery ended during that Reconstruction period, movies like Birth of a Nation
Yes.
and this whole genre of kind of Black men are predators, violent, brutes, bestial. that ended up getting played out in mainstream pornography as well.
For some of y'all don't know, the basic plot of Birth of a Nation is the Ku Klux Klan being enforcers and kind of like the mercenaries going after a black man who was accused or who, according to the movie's plot, raped a white woman.
Hmm.
And
And it's available. You can watch it
yeah,
on the internet now. It came out in 1915. It was a silent movie, and it was white
right,
performers dressed in blackface. But that is the premise that, we needed the Ku Klux Klan because black men were running amok and sexually assaulting white women. And
hmm,
so that kind of message that black men are dangerous, predatory, etc., is amplified in pornography as well.
right. And what's really interesting is the president at the time in 1915 was Woodrow Wilson, and
Mhm.
it has been quoted, which we have schools named
Mhm.
after. It was changed in Tacoma. That was a
Mhm.
good call, but it was Woodrow Wilson's favorite movie,
Wow.
and it was definitely a pro-Klan movie. So people have been quoted as saying that he said that it was his favorite movie.
Mhm.
Um, Before we transition and talk about how it promotes damaging profiles and stereotypes and stigmas of black men, please can you talk a little bit about how the lack of access to opportunities and the economic marginalization of black women often leads to careers and curiosity in the porn industry and as a sex worker.
Well, I work primarily with young women who have been trafficked in some ways or felt compelled to participate in the sex industry in terms of prostitution or pornography because they didn't have other economic opportunities or they were exploited by men in their community, men who are also economically disadvantaged. So, and that speaks to the school system that you talked about, because some of that happens in school settings where girls are trafficked or pimped. So so much of it is associated with lack of opportunities. Maybe young women who are in foster care who have history of child sexual abuse, for example. So they have multiple vulnerabilities that make them vulnerable to participating. Now, some people would argue that it can be a choice. If you're minor and you're underage, it really isn't a choice. It is a form of sexual victimization and abuse. Minors can't give consent.
Right. Yeah. And we saw that situation when in the story of the young sister Centoya,
Mm-hmm.
and
Centoya
where she
Brown.
say that one more time.
Centoya Brown.
Yes, Centoya Brown. I don't know if people know the story or not, but she was being trafficked and quote unquote, for lack of a better term, pimped out by an older male. I think she was 15 at the time.
Mm-hmm.
She was in the foster care system,
Mm-hmm.
so that definitely aligns with your example. And she was she had a client, one night, and she felt like her life was being threatened, and she pulled his gun, and she killed him.
Mm-hmm.
And there was some stuff going around, I think, in defense of the man that she had murdered, which was an adult. I think he was in his late 30s, if not his 40s. And he often sought the pleasuring, from minors, which is an issue. But all that was kind of thrown out the door. A couple of things were happening. you know Got to dig into our lexicon that Dr. West is teaching her. There was a lot of adultifying that was going on, because all of a sudden Centoya Brown was not a child. She was an adult,
Mm-hmm.
and treated like one. And her pimp, you know what I'm saying? I forget his name. I used to know his name. I have her book. I read her book.
Mm-hmm.
Um, he wasn't
His
even
nickname
charged.
was Cutthroat.
There you go. I don't think he,
Mhm.
based on what I had studied at the time, I don't think he was even charged. I don't think he
No.
was even brought up on charges.
Mhm.
And she ended up getting free. I want to say after 15 years, and I know last time I checked in on her, she had gotten married. But don't quote me on how long she was in prison. She
Mhm.
was in prison
Mhm.
for a minute though.
Right.
You know what I'm
And
saying?
I
So,
think again, we have to think about language. Language is important. You said this
mhm,
man was a client. Well, if you snatch a young kid off the street and sexually
mhm.
assault them, you're a predator,
Right,
child
right,
rapist. But if you give the kid money,
right.
then they're
It's
in
the client.
trouble.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
looking at the lens and really seeing the victimization
Right.
in the lives of young women in particular.
Right. I'm glad you brought that up because that's a good pushback because we talked about this offline about the language that is politically correct. And I've learned that the word prostitute is not the correct term to use. And you said that it should be prostituted because you don't want um, the young person or the person who is, selling their bodies to be looked at as an object. And I was said, oh, I thought that the term sex worker was the appropriate term, and you had said that that term too is actually being pushed back upon and questioned too, because it objectifies the person who are selling
Right. If
their
it's
body.
really how much of it is really a choice.
Right.
And sometimes when we use sex worker, are we sometimes sanitizing this? Are we
Hmm.
does it sanitize some of the violence that's going on here as
Right.
well? And I understand it's really complex and there are, if you're an adult, maybe there are people who say I'm making a free choice to do this, but certainly if you're a minor and you're underage, you cannot give consent.
Hmm.
And there is an element of victimization here. So recognizing that, particularly with Black girls who who are already adultified and never really seen as victims.
Hmm. Well, what? Yeah, I have to keep reminding myself that not all sex work is safe and amongst consenting adults, and there's a lot of nuance when it comes to choice. No matter what your cousin Kanye West says, um, I think everyone always has a choice, but you know the choice should be definitely determined by the quality of the choice you have. If the choice is, what I'm saying, selling your body or selling drugs or going to jail or going to a cemetery or an urn, you know, I don't really like those choices. You know what I'm
Those are
saying?
constrained choices. Those are not actual choices. It's not
Gotcha.
like oftentimes people are deciding, well, should I go to Harvard and go to medical school or
Hmm.
have a great job or should I, sell my body?
Right.
That yeah, it's not those kinds of choices oftentimes.
Yeah, what I hear you saying also is that you have to consider the privilege when it comes to the choices that a person has. And it becomes a false equivalence if myself, um, a black heterosexual, male, um, who is making good money, what I'm saying, and doesn't have to do things to compromise my integrity or my freedom. That's a false equivalence to compare me
Mhm.
to like a Centoya Brown
Right. So
when it
very
comes to choices.
survival sex,
Right.
really, with people oftentimes having constrained choices and no really great choice. And it's between living and having money or having transportation or clothes or basic necessities of life. And
Hmm.
so keeping that in mind as well. So those
Yeah.
individuals aren't invisible.
Yeah. So sometimes what I do is, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later. I speak a little bit naively about sex work when I use the term sex work because it's like me like marginalizing it, thinking that sex work is done consensually and safely all the time, and it's not. You know what I'm saying? That's me with my utopian lenses on saying, well, maybe sex work isn't all that bad, what I'm saying, if it's done in a safe place and it can, be regulated and whatnot, and women are empowered, or just the people who are selling their bodies are empowered. But in reality, a lot of times it doesn't happen like that.
Yeah, I think sometimes we strive to be so sex positive, and I'm a sex educator as well. And so I'm not about controlling other people's
Absolutely.
sexuality.
Hmm.
Uh, but sometimes we're really afraid maybe to have that conversation. Is this really sex positive or is this self sexualization?
Hmm.
If it's not coming from a healthy place where you're really happy with it and you're doing it because you feel compelled to do certain things, I don't know that that's sex positive
Right,
or
right. Yeah.
empowering.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's a whole different rabbit hole. We're gonna maybe put our big toe in that a little bit later.
Mhm.
Um, but you mentioned the schools in relation to sex work or or prostitution and whatnot. And I want to add on to what you said. I would even go a little step further. And sometimes, people, like to romanticize education and say like, oh, we are, the great saviors, you know what I'm saying, of of all people, and we're the good guys. Um, and I like to keep it a kilo. When the education institution, and I'll speak for myself and my role in it, isn't always the good guy. And I could actually make the argument that we're worse than law enforcement or anything else, because everyone has, before they get a job, they usually, if not always, go through the education, what I'm saying, institutions that are provided for them before they become a police officer or any person that we would consider, not good for all of society. And when you said the schools, I immediately thought about, we don't teach our children trades to really be, self-sufficient, that they have to depend on, um, working for someone else, or, dependent on the government to give them what they can't give themselves. And that lends itself too many times to people doing things that is not healthy for them, whether it be selling their body, selling drugs, or committing other crimes that jeopardize and compromise their freedom and their safety. And so I always think about, like, especially for young women, how they're steered away from, like, you know, um, from trades at a very early age, you know, in so many subtle, clandestine, thinly veiled ways. We dog whistle to young girls like, you're not gonna be doing construction. You're not gonna be working on cars. You're not gonna be doing any kind of plumbing or apprentice work. That's a man's job.
Mhm.
And when we look at it, those are jobs that are really high paying trades. And
Mhm.
when we start to um, promote this economic exclusion, and we don't promote economic inclusion when it comes to young girls, I could definitely sit down and get my Googles on and bring out my books of how that leads to people being introduced into lifestyles and life choices that are not beneficial to them being successful. And it's more beneficial for them just doing whatever to survive.
Right. So economic, so much of it is building wealth, building economic security so that people do have other options.
Right. Right. And the educational, system that I work in does a good job of disrupting that.
Mhm.
It's like, we want to make sure that you graduate, be compliant, and you go on to a 4 year or a 2 year, which is more than likely going to put you in debt. And debt, we know, is another form of slavery. You know what I'm saying? There's all kinds of research and all kinds of data, and you know surrounding how, being in debt is just another way, of being enslaved, economically. And then when we look at the sex industry, it's like you're in debt to the people who are making the movies. You're in debt to the pimps in so many different ways and different forms that they come into being, to rule over you, and it's not something that we really even, well, there was a time where there were madams, where they would, house and pimp other women, They had brothels and whatnot. Um, but of course, that came with a stigma too. But it's like the whole sex industry is
Well, kids are also being pimped out by their peers. They're
hmm
being pimped out. Gangs, street gangs are sometimes
that's
involved in
true.
this. Family members may be involved in it. Foster parents, biological parents, step parents. So it takes variety of forms.
Right. And I've watched some interviews of porn performers who are women, and they talk about their lives. Very few of them, say things like, "Oh yeah, this is great work. Yeah, I would be doing this even if, such and such didn't happen in my life." And the majority of stories that I have researched and have come across is, they have a history of trauma, whether it's sexual abuse, they, they lacked, economic opportunities. And if they had a choice, they wouldn't do it because their sex life is definitely disrupted because of this, their personal sex life. And and then they have the stigma from doing the work. Like
Mm.
you don't just, retire from porn and then, at 20 or whatever you're in your prime, after you retire, it's probably like in your 30s or something. You don't walk away from it and expecting people to be rolling out the red carpet and ready to accept your, resume because it has a
Well,
stigma attached to it.
I think at the end of the day, we have to understand we have to give people real choices. And I think sometimes the industry, or what I'm seeing in mainstream pornography, normalizing this, making it seem as this is what you should be doing. But we also have to understand, well, what real choices are we making sure that we are giving young people? When the reality is it's harder to go to college and be able to afford it. There aren't livable wage jobs. Uh, and people feeling really rightly so that they have limited choices. So
hmm
understanding that too, that it's not just an individual decision, but the way our society is structured.
hmm Before we transition over to how porn, profiles and stereotypes black men, I want you to talk a little bit about the debate between um, porn and the sex industry and you know hip hop acts like um, Megan Thee Stallion and Cardi B are empowering black women and women in general, and versus it's objectifying themselves, over sexualizing themselves, and it's not empowering it at all. It actually just feeds into more and more stereotypes and sets young people up to grow up to be um, used for their bodies as sexual objects rather than their minds.
I think that's so complex. And I think we can't maybe limited to certain performers or something like that. These are
Yeah,
women. Maybe it works for Megan Thee Stallion or Cardi B, but I think we also have to realize that maybe that's not going to work so well for all young black women. So my
right.
concern is that we aren't sort of selling them a bill of goods by saying, if you just do this, if you can perform in this way, like your life is going to be perfect in some ways. That's not going to be the reality for many young black women. So giving them other images of themselves, other images where black women are educated or powerful in other ways other than being limited to this one narrow definition. I think that is what's going to be so critical.
But somebody might say Cardi B and Meg Thee Stallion is that, but we don't focus on it. Meg Thee Stallion went back to school, and I think she's getting her master's or a degree. And
Mhm.
Cardi B has been, you know, definitely been, magnified and amplified when it comes to speaking on certain social issues. So someone could make the argument that, yeah, they're showing off their bodies, but they're also intelligent women that are pursuing education.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that they aren't. I don't, know these women individually, but I would just like to see, like, we sometimes reduce black men to sports as if there is nothing else
Hmm.
for
Hmm.
them.
The
And to
dumb jock.
also, yeah,
Hmm.
so making sure that black women see themselves as more than their sexuality is what's
Hmm.
going to be critical, and that we celebrate a wide variety of all that black women can be. I mean, black women in the STEM fields, in science and technology, and just opening up more avenues for them in terms of who and what they can be. I
Hmm.
think at the end of the day, that's going to be what's going to be critical.
Right. Giving them more options,
Mhm.
diversifying their portfolio. What would be your response when I said, if I were to say, Dr. West, but Black people need to reclaim their bodies, specifically Black women? For hundreds of years, we've followed the generational curse. Chattel slavery has haunted us where we haven't controlled our bodies. And, many times when we are showing our bodies or we're being sexually liberated, we're just saying that, we're reclaiming our bodies. This is my body. I do what I want with it as long as it's safe and it's with a consenting adult, and it's empowering. And every time someone tries to stop me from doing what I want with my body, they're doing nothing but mocking the oppressor and trying to control what doesn't belong to them. Me being sexually liberated is empowering, and I get to show off my goods if I want to. What will be your response?
My response would be it's an individual it's an individual thing, and we have to just be asking that person, and that person needs to be asking themselves, are they also able to live with the consequences? Are they doing it in a healthy, respectful way where they're not victimizing somebody else? And is it coming from a place of real sexual empowerment, or is it acting out some unaddressed trauma? So
Mhm.
I think that's only something that that individual person can answer. But
Yeah.
I think we part of it is I just think we need to have critical conversations about sex and sexuality and making sure that people have a foundation. I teach a course on human sexuality, and it
Mhm.
breaks my heart when I'm talking to college students who don't even know basic biology 101.
Mhm.
So I'm not so sure if people are out doing whatever they're doing to just make sure it's coming from a healthy place
Mhm.
and not a
Yeah.
place of lacking, and you're trying to overcompensate for something else.
Overcompensate. That's a good point. What I also heard you say when you were talking about diversifying, your resume and what you can do as a Black person, specifically a Black woman, and not just be showing off your body, is that we need more balance in our images of Black people. And there seems to be an imbalance of us being, sexually objectified, or we're playing some kind of sport, or we're always singing and dancing. Um, so that's what I heard.
Yeah.
You, you know, I you know I battle a lot, especially with the genre that of music that I love and appreciate the most, being a hip hop historian, but also performer and producer. I battle a lot with the content because I got to keep it a kilo, and I got to always be an educator. There's parts of it that I find really, really empowering. I think um, almost anything, pretty much almost anything when it comes to hip hop and artistic expression, um, can can be meaningful, can be empowering because it's art, just like any kind of movie you watch. But I am with you when it's like when there's that imbalance that really disrupts things. I watch WAP, and I know from my scholarship that for thousands of years we've worshiped and recognized and found beauty in the yoni or the vagina. You know what I'm saying? And it wasn't a thing of weakness or anything. But I also understand when you're watching WAP, um, it it marginalizes, you know what I'm saying, that part of the woman's body and it objectifies it. So I see it both ways. I feel the same way when I listen to and watch the video for Baby Got Back. I feel like, Sir Mix-a-Lot song talking about,
Mhm.
black women's big butts. I think it has an incredible political statement. And I think it's protest music. But at the same time, I see it as objectifying black women. And I think what I hear you saying is that we need a balance. But if we're being forced into these positions and in these types of imagery and how we promote ourselves as a not only as individuals as a people, then it needs to be on our terms. And too many times it's not on our terms.
Yeah, I mean, if it's just certain performers who profit from this and it's good for them, I'm not so sure how that benefits the larger Black
Mhm.
community. And that's what we have to remember too.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that we talked about offline, I said, it's not so much what people are doing in that realm, but I just think that we don't have enough safe places for people to really do it and to be educated. Like, I think that's where we need to start. I think that black people, for some amount of time, I don't, know how long it needs to be, that we do need opportunities just to be free and reclaim our bodies, but it needs to be
Mhm.
done in a safe place. It's kind of like shooting a gun. I mean, your sexuality is a very powerful and impactful thing, kind of like a gun. But you don't want to go out in your community and just start shooting things.
Mhm.
You want to go to a gun range. That's a safe place. I don't know what that looks like. I'm not telling people to start these organized, safe places where they, they start swinging and having orgies and stuff. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that we need to find safe places to really educate ourselves on, sexuality, sex, how we perform it, reclaiming our bodies. And there's a problem. When I was a coach, and I've been coaching for over, 20 years basketball, when I walk into a community center and I'm coaching basketball, that they don't have mandatory trainings on, on sexual abuse or what's appropriate, what I'm saying, when we're interacting with minors and what does grooming look like? I think that's highly irresponsible. I think it's highly irresponsible when you go to most churches and, they're not having those same conversations when we know that the church is a place where there's predators and there's people preying on other people. And it's used as, kind of like a social caste system to sometimes, prey on the most vulnerable in our community. I think it's totally irresponsible when we have these places where we congregate and we're personal and adults are with children and there are vulnerable people there with, traumas hidden and, above ground, that we're not talking about how people can be exploited, you
Yeah,
know?
so it's not just the negative aspect of sexuality, the
Right.
victimization and the abuse, but also what makes you happy, what feels healthy, what feels safe to you,
Mhm,
uh, in that context as well. And I think
mhm.
that what troubles me about some of what I see in pornography or popular media, I don't hear us as much talking about, well, maybe a healthy sexual expression is within the context of a monogamous, safe relationship either. It's just like, just whatever,
That's
you
not a
know.
genre? No, I'm being serious right now. No, no, I'm being serious. I know that sounded funny. That is a genre, right? In porn, right? Monogamous relationships?
Nobody wants to see that.
Uh,
It's not generally a thing. And so
oh,
that's what I mean.
okay.
Is
All right.
that, yeah,
Okay.
we just, it's kind of
That,
like,
that's not the highest selling porn title out there.
no.
Monogamous sex.
Yeah. In the context of a loving, intimate relationship. No, that's
20-year
not.
marriage sex.
No, I'm not aware of anything like that. Uh, No, so but seriously, I think that we don't see that enough. When we talk about its sexual empowerment, it's like with whoever, wherever, and whatever, and you're just out running amok. But we don't, and it's okay to tell people that as well.
But maybe that, and I would say this, I would push back a little bit. Maybe that has a lot to do with who's creating the porn and who predominates the leadership positions and administrative positions in porn, and it's usually men, and it's usually white men. So I think if more women, I've actually heard, and I told you I nerd out, I'm a blurred. I've actually heard of feminist porn
Mhm.
and where women have a lot more ownership, direction, and
Mhm.
stuff like that. And I wonder within that genre of feminist porn, do you have a lot more of 20-year marriage?
No, uh, but but most of that's behind a paywall too.
Yeah,
So, but what people really have access to is the free porn sites in that. So most of that is again the stereotypical type of images that I talked about earlier.
yeah. Maybe we can start a whole genre of responsible porn. Go get a condom porn, the series.
Yeah, people oftentimes just don't want to see that because it messes with the fantasy. But
Yeah, it does.
yeah,
It
so
does.
people, so we're maybe kind of taught to look for what porn should be.
Or the best
And
kind of porn would be celibate porn.
okay, I don't think that's a thing either. But
That's
so
a that's a really responsible porn.
yeah,
Celibate porn. Anyways, okay, real quick. Not real quick, because I don't want to do that to black men, but we might have to do a part two. With all seriousness, we spend a lot of time on black women, and I don't even like the term black girls, so I'm gonna say black young women or black women minors. And I did that on purpose. I wanted to lead with them because um I live by a mantra is that the strongest in our community um should support and protect the most vulnerable. And when we're talking about porn, in all seriousness, in the porn industry, I think that black women are the most vulnerable. And I think to a greater part in the sex trafficking spectrum, I think it's children. So that's why I wanted to start with like just focusing and concentrating on black women because I wanted to honor your documentary, which was so well done. And I felt like it really showcased how black women are the most vulnerable because they're not the CEOs, they're not in administrative ranks most of the time. Um, they're workers, they're servants, for lack of a better term, and they're put in these scenes and these predicaments because they're already excluded from economic, what I'm saying, opportunities outside of that porn industry. So that being said, can you talk about how or please talk about how the porn industry and pornography perpetuates and amplifies stereotypes of black men.
so really in the same ways that it does with black women. So out of that long history, black men disproportionately more likely to be depicted as violent, predatory, abusers or aggressors with large genitalia that they use in a sort of weaponized fashion and
Hmm.
dehumanized, really. And
Yeah.
so, sort of reducing, and people would say, well, it's porn. What do you expect? But
Hmm.
when you add race on top of that, it just makes it really much more problematic. And I think about that when I think about what happened at Mother Emanuel Church when Dylan Roof shot up the place. He said, "You're raping our women, and you have to go." And so there are people who internalize that notion that, and he was shooting up older black women. So it didn't even really make any sense. But this notion that black men are predatory and violent is a theme that seems to run through pornography. that kind of uniquely targets Black men in a different kind of way, and sexualizing again historical trauma. So porn will oftentimes create a parody of mainstream movies. So when 12 Years a Slave came out, they produced 12 Inches a Slave and sort of
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
made jokes
These titles are
around.
hilarious. Go ahead.
Yeah, and so, but they used titles that came directly out of antebellum period, of black bucks, black beasts, and that kind of thing. So I get concerned because it limits black male sexuality too. If
Hmm.
the notion is that that's all you can do, is that your world is this ginormous Jurassic Park sized penis, and that's all you are reduced to as well, that doesn't create the foundation for super healthy relationships.
Dr. West, I really need you to stop trying to make me laugh. That was a pretty super duper intense um, descriptor that you Jurassic Park size. Okay. I've never seen a dinosaur penis before, but it's big, I guess, according to your description. Um, but it also creates the anxiety, in all seriousness, that I'm not a man if I can perform how I see these men performing on these videos. I'm gonna take it a step further because I strive to go deep and I plant seeds. That being said, it can also um, take away the emotional value of sex. So I'm going to overcompensate for me not having a big penis and looking like, what I'm saying, Mr. Marcus, what I'm saying, with my hat turned backwards with my Timberlands on. And I'm just going to be super duper like aggressive when it comes to sex. And at times I'm going to be violent to overcompensate me not being very good at the act in general.
Well, I mean, if you look at the descriptors, sex is described, not certainly as intimacy in porn, but pounding, ripping, tearing, all of these kind of violent terminology. And so
Mhm.
if that becomes your template for what sex should be like, again, that's not going to be the foundation for intimacy.
Right. I remember this quote from Lil Wayne. I won't give the exact quote because it's pretty crass, but I remember he got a lot of heat some years ago because he says, "I beat the, what I'm saying, vagina up like what did he say? Emmett Till."
Wow.
And that is so deep. That is so deep because Emmett Till was essentially murdered for quote unquote allegedly eye raping a white woman. And so it's like so many compounded, traumas with that statement. It's like
Mm-hmm.
you're beating it up until it's dead. And you're right, we get that a lot. I beat it up, I killed it. It's like, what the heck? Like, we got to change how we talk around sex with each other. Because I know dang well if a woman talking about, what I'm saying, I'm about to rip it off and what I'm saying, wave it above my head. I'm like, then we're not doing it. No, that doesn't sound fun to me at all. It doesn't sound pleasing. That doesn't sound like verbal foreplay at all. But on the other end, he's talking about the the racial profiling of a young boy with a older white woman, that because he's so quote unquote or allegedly or stereotyped of being so sexually endowed that even at the age of 15 he becomes a threat to a grown woman, that he's going to rape her just by looking at her.
Right.
And
And
that
so
has been,
porn
yeah,
flips
go ahead.
the script to make it
Hmm.
seem like now that's positive, a
Exactly.
positive thing, when historically that was the thing that got Black men lynched. And you
Hmm.
see that a lot in uh, mainstream porn. And
Hmm.
so we're almost telling Black men, well, no, this is a positive stereotype because you're so virile and so masculine. But
Hmm.
again, there's a dehumanization
Yeah,
that's
it's
associated with
adultifying.
that. Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
adultifying, like you said, especially with Emmett Till. Um, because and then it's also, it creates that trope. and that stereotype that black men are beasts, we're
Mhm.
animals, you know, and we're always trying to have sex with somebody's woman. And you know what I'm saying? But I think that goes to some deep rooted, um, that's another R, deep
Mhm.
rooted foundations of racism. And I have a theory that racism is really three R's, and it's the fear of reproduction, the the fear of not having resources, and also the fear um, of us, taking revenge.
Mhm.
And when we talk about reproduction, we know that Jim Crow included miscegenation laws for a reason, because there was a fear that black men would impregnate black women, I mean, white women, pardon self, and that there will be a whole bunch of, what I'm saying, quote unquote, mixed children, biracial children, and that the white race would kind of like die off. That's a real fear for white people, along with them not having enough resources to survive. So another reason why they just go all around the planet Earth and where there are, melanated people and, just, colonize them. You know what I'm saying? And don't want us to do for ourselves because they fear that we will seek the revenge, which would probably come back to the first R. The revenge might be having sex with all their women. You know what I'm saying? That's a real thing. There's actually a genre of porn that is predominantly white men who are with white women who like to see their girlfriends and their wives who are white have sex with black men. Like, that's a genre. I forget what the genre was called, but like you
It's a
said, that
subset of,
is
yeah,
say that
interracial
again.
porn. It's a subset of interracial porn.
Yeah, but it's like, no, he sits there and watches his wife have sex with a black man, like that turns them on. So it's like, a lot of the things that we're seeing, if not all the things that we're seeing that is happening that exploits black women, we're seeing the same thing happen to black men. But because of the power dynamic and the power differential between black men and black women, it's a unique experience. I've actually had black men tell me that, oh, I'm not into any pedophilia or anything, but I would rather have my son, who is a minor, have sex or receive oral sex from an older woman than to be gay. And a lot of these porns are perpetuating, what I'm saying, that situation and that experience of, underage looking black men having sex with grown women.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's out there. That genre. I mean, there are actually black actors that look really, really young, but they're really, really hung. And it's a whole genre where they look like they're kids or they're minors, but they're having sex with grown women. But it's the same thing what they do with the whole thing with black cheerleaders. You know, where they got to remind you that all the actors in this film are over 18, even though they look like they're, what I'm saying, 14,
Mhm.
and they're dressing up like quote unquote, what I'm saying, little girls. So yeah,
So it's a complex topic, and so that's a little bit about the research that I've been doing recently.
right, right. So, anyways, I really appreciate. We're gonna wrap
Mhm.
up, and I like to wrap up with a plan of action. And I would like you to go first. A lot of what we shared today is very overwhelming. We've been talking for over an hour. We're in an hour and 9 minutes now. Based on the information that we share between us, what do you think the plan of action is?
I think the plan of action is to provide, particularly for young people, comprehensive, medically accurate sex education that is not based on a pornified lens, and also making sure that people have economic opportunities that give them options to the sex industry.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, yeah, I like that one. To add on to what you're saying, I think the plan of action is we have to change the culture of our communities and we have to protect the most vulnerable in our community, which is the children. And those children, we have to always keep in mind that those children grow up to be adults, you know what I'm saying, in the most fortunate, you know what I'm saying, circumstance. And some children do die before they become adults. But we need to start raising our children like they're going to be responsible, healthy, you know what I'm saying, non-toxic adults that strive to be better. And that means that we have to start treating our children like we treat other material possessions that we consider very valuable. Um, you know, just growing up in the Black community, I know there is a subculture, a criminal subculture that has a lot of respect for money and drugs and other material objects, where people will actually hurt you and sometimes kill you if you mess with their money or drugs, or if you just disrespect their enterprise that includes placing a high value on material objects. That's how we need to start treating our children, and treating people um, how they treat, children. Like, I'm not telling people to go out and have lynch mobs, but it's as simple as, man, we got to start telling on people, you know what I'm saying, who are doing stuff to kids. Stop letting family members and friends of the family that we know are suspect in that, saying
Mm.
have abused children. Stop letting them babysit, our children. Stop letting them come to the barbecue. You know what I'm saying? And anyways, I just know that I'm just gonna speak for my family, because I don't want to start, giving any prescriptions for anybody else, and then someone says that I'm promoting violence. I know that I raised my children in a way that I limited their opportunities for them to be abused, because there ain't gonna be too much talking if you do something to my children. And so I educated our children, but also they couldn't just go over anyone's house, you know what I'm saying? And they were supervised and they were monitored. And I know that comes with a lot of privilege. I know some of us don't have the privilege to always monitor and supervise our children because we're working in this crass capitalist, consumer economy. But I think we could do better. Anyways,
I
Dr.
think that'll
West,
work. There's a
maybe
lot
we
of
could
work
do,
that needs to be done.
yeah, maybe we could do this sometime real soon. I really enjoyed this. This was awesome. I could talk to you for hours and hours. Thank you for stimulating my blurred brain, and that's a black nerd brain if you're not hip. And thanks for taking the time to be on the show. I really appreciate you. You could be doing anything else in the world, but you chose to be here on Seed Talk, and I appreciate you.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, peace.